911, what's the location of the emergency?
Some guy just hit this old lady with a big wooden stick.
Okay. Let me get medical.
Yeah.
Stay on the line.
Yeah, she's bleeding really bad.
She was just waiting to cross the street. That is all she was doing. 75 years old, standing at a crosswalk in Seattle, Washington, on a cold December afternoon in 2025. She was not in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was in a normal place doing a normal thing. That is what makes this story so difficult to sit with. Within seconds, her face was shattered. Within days, she would lose the sight in her right eye permanently. And the man who did it, the man who swung a wooden board studded with metal screws directly into her face, had been arrested 8 times in that same calendar year. 8 times. He had been arrested, processed, and released. Arrested, processed, and released. Over and over in the same city in the same year, while this woman went about her life unaware that the system designed to protect her had quietly stopped working. This is her story. This is also the story of a city, and it is a story about what happens when the people who are supposed to keep dangerous individuals off the street run out of reasons to do so. My name is not important. What is important is that you hear this. December in Seattle is a particular kind of gray. The sky does not commit to rain and does not commit to clearing. It just hangs there low and heavy the way it does for weeks at a time in the Pacific Northwest winter. The holiday lights are already up along the commercial streets. The coffee shops are warm inside. People move through the city in their coats, heads down, navigating the same sidewalks they have navigated for years. For a 75-year-old woman whose name has been withheld from public reporting to protect her privacy and whom we will refer to simply as Margaret, this was an ordinary day. Margaret lived in Seattle. She had, by all accounts, lived in or near the city for much of her adult life. She knew its streets. She knew its rhythms. She knew which intersections got backed up in the afternoon and which bus lines ran late when the weather turned. She was not naive about Seattle's struggles. Nobody who lived there in 2025 could be. The city had spent years grappling with a visible and growing crisis of public safety. Open-air drug use had become common on major streets. Encampments had expanded and contracted and expanded again. Retail theft had risen to the point where some downtown businesses installed barriers around their entrances. And violent attacks on ordinary pedestrians, unprovoked, random, brutal, had made headlines repeatedly throughout the year. But people still live in cities like that. They still go to the grocery store. They still take walks. They still stand at crosswalks waiting for the light to change. That is what Margaret was doing. She was standing at the crosswalk waiting. The light had not yet changed. A man approached from her left. She may not have noticed him at first, or she may have noticed him and looked away the way people do in cities. A brief glance, an automatic assessment, and then eyes forward again, waiting for the walk signal. His name was Fale. He was 42 years old. He was carrying a wooden board with metal screws embedded in its surface, and he was walking directly toward her. The walk signal had not yet turned white. It never got the chance to matter. Every violent event has a threshold. There is always a moment, brief, often invisible, where the trajectory can still change, where something interrupts the path, where the person in motion chooses differently or hesitates or simply turns and walks the other way. For this attack, that moment existed. Fale had been moving through Seattle all day. Security camera footage later reviewed by investigators would show him in the area of the attack for some time before it occurred. He had not been hiding. He had not been moving quickly. He had been visible on public sidewalks carrying an object that, had anyone looked closely, was clearly a weapon. A board with screws in it is not a tool. Not in that context, not being carried like that. But nobody stopped him. Nobody called anything in. Nobody intervened. This is not a criticism of bystanders. The city that Margaret lived in had, by December 2025, normalized a degree of erratic and disturbing public behavior to such an extent that the threshold for alarm had shifted. People carrying unusual objects on sidewalks had become a more familiar sight than anyone wanted to admit. The social cues that might once have prompted a call to 911 had been dulled by years of exposure to a crisis that never fully resolved. So Fale moved through the city unimpeded. He passed storefronts. He passed other pedestrians. He moved along the block where the crosswalk was. And then he saw Margaret. We do not know what he was thinking in that moment. We do not know if he chose her deliberately or if she was simply closest. We do not know if something specific triggered what he did next, or if there was no reason at all. That uncertainty is its own kind of horror. Because if there was no reason, then there was no warning possible. Then anyone standing at any crosswalk in Seattle that day could have been Margaret. The light was still red. Fale raised the board. It took seconds, not minutes, seconds. Fale swung the wooden board, heavy, reinforced with metal screws, directly into Margaret's face. The sound would have been terrible. The force of it broke bones. Margaret was 75 years old. She was a small person standing at a crosswalk who had done nothing except be present in a public space. She had no warning. She had no time to raise her hands or turn away. The board connected with her face. She went down. The screws embedded in the wood screws that had no structural purpose, that served only to make the weapon more destructive, tore into her skin. She was bleeding on the sidewalk. People nearby froze first. That is the universal response to sudden extreme violence. The brain does not process it immediately. It stutters, recalibrates, tries to match what the eyes are seeing to something that makes sense. This does not make sense. A 75-year-old woman is bleeding on the ground at a crosswalk. The man who hit her is still standing there. And then several things happened at once. Bystanders rushed to her, voices were raised. Someone called 911 and Fale began to move. Margaret was conscious. She was in agony. She was bleeding from her face. Her cheekbones had been fractured. Her right eye, the eye closest to the point of impact, had been irreparably damaged. She would never see from it again. Somewhere nearby, a security camera was recording everything. The 911 call came in fast. Bystanders, pedestrians who had witnessed the attack, people who had been nearby on that December afternoon, did not hesitate. They called for help. Several of them stayed with Margaret, crouching beside her on the cold concrete, talking to her, keeping her from going into shock alone. This matters. It should be said clearly and without qualification. The people who stopped, who stayed, who made the calls, who did not walk past, they did exactly what human beings are supposed to do for each other. They are part of this story too. Seattle Police Department responded quickly. Officers arrived at the scene while Fale was still in the immediate area. This was critical. In many of these ways, in the broader category of random, unprovoked street attacks that had plagued Seattle throughout 2025, suspects disappear into the city before any effective response is possible. That did not happen here. Officers located Fale within a short distance of the attack. He still had the board. The weapon that had broken an elderly woman's face and destroyed the sight in her right eye was still in his possession when police caught up with him. He was placed under arrest. For investigators, the presence of the weapon was significant, not because they needed it to establish what had happened, since the attack was captured on surveillance footage, but because it removed any ambiguity about intent. Carrying a board with screws through a populated area is not accidental. It is not incidental. It is a choice. Fale was handcuffed. He was transported to a police facility. And here is where the story becomes not just a crime story, but a policy story. Because when police ran Fale's record, what they found was not a person who had recently descended into erratic behavior. What they found was a person who had been in their system continuously throughout the year. 8 arrests in 2025 alone. 8. The question that every detective, every officer, every prosecutor, and every citizen would ask in the days that followed was the same. How was he still on the street? The interrogation room in a Seattle police facility is not dramatic. It is not the way these rooms look in movies or in prestige television, all steel and one-way glass and calculated psychological theater. It is functional. A table, chairs, fluorescent light, a camera mounted in the corner, a door that locks from the outside. Fale was brought in and seated. He had been processed. His hands had been documented, photographed, checked for injuries consistent with the attack. He had been read his rights. He had been offered water. Now he sat across from detectives who already knew a great deal. They had the footage. They had the weapon. They had the scene. They had witness accounts from multiple bystanders. In interrogation training, experienced detectives are taught a fundamental principle. You do not begin by telling the subject what you know. You begin by asking questions to which you already have the answers. You watch for the inconsistencies. You measure the gap between what the subject says and what the evidence has already established. The gap tells you everything. The detectives began with baseline questions. Where had Fale been that day? What had he been doing? Did he know the woman who was in the hospital? Had he been at that intersection? Every question was an opportunity. Every answer, truthful or not, created a record. And Fale sitting in that chair under fluorescent light, with his history of 8 prior arrests in the same calendar year, understood something that most people in that room understand. This was not his first interaction with law enforcement. He had sat in the rooms like this before. He knew how this worked, but knowing how something works and being able to escape its consequences are two very different things. The detectives had seen the footage. They knew exactly what had happened. The question was whether Fale would make the choice to acknowledge it and what his explanation would be when he did. The details of Fale's interrogation have not been fully disclosed in public reporting as of the time this script was produced. That is not unusual. In active criminal cases, interrogation transcripts and recorded statements are typically withheld from the public until the case moves through the court system. Defense attorneys file motions. Prosecutors manage evidentiary disclosure. The full picture emerges in fragments over months, sometimes over years. What can be said is this: Fale was in the system. He was known. He had a record that stretched back well beyond 2025. And that record, those 8 arrests in a single year, created a context for investigators that no amount of alternative explanation could easily overcome. When a person has been arrested 8 times in 12 months and is then caught within minutes of a violent assault with the weapon still in hand, the narrative available to them is extremely limited. What detectives typically look for in situations like this, and this is informed by publicly available forensic psychology literature on violent offenders, is not a confession in the classical sense. They are looking for the subject's theory of the event. Does he claim he was defending himself? Does he claim the woman was the aggressor? Does he claim he has no memory? Does he claim someone else was responsible? Each of these positions, however implausible, tells investigators something about the subject's state of mind and level of premeditation. A claim of self-defense against a 75-year-old woman at a crosswalk, for instance, would require a specific kind of cognitive distortion. A distortion that in the context of forensic mental health evaluation would be highly relevant to how the case proceeded. A claim of no memory would invite toxicology screening. A claim of mistaken identity with a weapon in hand and footage of the attack would represent something else entirely. Whatever Fale said in that room, the evidence surrounding him was overwhelming. The footage was clear. The weapon was real. The victim was in surgery. And his record, those 8 arrests, was sitting in a file on the table between him and the detectives, impossible to ignore. In a case like this, investigation is not primarily a mystery. The perpetrator is known. The weapon is recovered. The footage is clear. Multiple witnesses are available. What investigation in this context means is architecture. The prosecutors need to build something that withstands every challenge a defense attorney will bring. Every link in the chain of evidence must be documented, logged, authenticated. Every witness account must be collected in a formal statement. Every frame of surveillance footage must be extracted and preserved with chain of custody documentation. Every injury must be photographed, measured, and linked through forensic testimony to the weapon. This is meticulous, unglamorous work, but it is the foundation of accountability. The surveillance footage was central. Seattle, like most major American cities, has a dense network of cameras on storefronts, on transit infrastructure, on municipal buildings, on private businesses. The crosswalk where the attack occurred was within view of at least one camera, and investigators worked quickly to identify and preserve that footage before it could be overwritten or lost. Overwriting is a real threat in these cases. Most security camera systems operate on a rolling loop. Footage is recorded over older footage after a certain number of days. In violent crime investigations, one of the first priorities is always to contact every property owner in the area and request preservation of any footage from the relevant time window. The Seattle detectives working this case moved fast. They also conducted formal interviews with every identified witness, bystanders who had been present at the crosswalk, people who had seen Fale in the minutes before the attack, anyone who could place him in the area carrying the weapon moving toward the intersection. The medical component of the investigation was equally important. Margaret's injuries were formally documented at the hospital. The fractures to her facial bones, the damage to her right eye, the pattern of injury consistent with a forceful blow from a rigid object at a specific angle. A forensic examiner reviewed the injuries in the context of the weapon, the board, with its embedded screws, and produced findings that confirmed scientifically and formally what the footage had already shown. The medical documentation also established permanency. Margaret would not recover her sight in her right eye. That permanent loss is legally significant. It distinguishes this crime from a simple assault. It elevates the harm and with it, the severity of the charges. The forensic trail was solid. The case against Fale was not a question of guilt. It was a question of consequence. And that question would be answered in a courtroom. Fale was charged with first-degree assault. In Washington state, first-degree assault is a Class A felony, the most serious felony classification in the state's penal code. Under Washington law, a person commits first-degree assault when they assault another person with intent to inflict great bodily harm using a deadly weapon or force likely to produce great bodily harm or death. The wooden board with metal screws constituted a deadly weapon under Washington's definition. The intent to inflict great bodily harm could be inferred and argued from the deliberate construction of the weapon, from the force of the blow, and from the targeting of an elderly victim who could not effectively resist or flee. The outcome, fractured facial bones, permanent loss of vision, demonstrated the great bodily harm that was inflicted. Under Washington's standard sentencing grid, first-degree assault carries a sentence range that varies based on the defendant's criminal history score. Fale's criminal history score was not low. It could not be. 8 arrests in a single calendar year layered on top of whatever prior record existed before 2025 represented a criminal history that would push his sentencing range toward the upper end of the grid. In Washington, first-degree assault carries a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. The standard sentencing range for an offender with a significant criminal history falls substantially above the minimum, typically in the range of several years in state prison. The judge in such a case also has the authority to impose an exceptional sentence above the standard range if aggravating factors are found, including the vulnerability of the victim, which in this case was obvious and documented. A 75-year-old woman is, under Washington's sentencing law, a particularly vulnerable victim. That designation carries weight. It carries it precisely because the law recognizes what common sense already knows: attacking an elderly person who cannot defend themselves is not the same as attacking someone who can. The prosecution's goal was a sentence that matched the severity of what had been done, not just to Margaret, but to every person who uses a sidewalk in Seattle. Step back from the evidence for a moment. Set aside the footage, the weapon, the medical reports, the witness statements, and look instead at the man sitting in the interrogation room. Fale was 42 years old. He had been arrested 8 times in 2025. Not convicted 8 times, arrested 8 times. Those are different things, and the difference is important, but the pattern is not. 8 arrests in a year represents something wrong. It represents a person in severe crisis, whether that crisis is psychiatric, substance-related, situational, or some combination of all three. It represents a system that encountered that person repeatedly and did not at any point in those encounters find a mechanism to interrupt the trajectory. Forensic psychologists who study this population, individuals with high-frequency contact with law enforcement, consistently identify several overlapping factors. The first is substance dependency. Fale's case materials have not publicly specified whether he was under the influence at the time of the attack, but the pattern of repeated low-level arrests followed by escalating violence is consistent with a substance abuse trajectory that intensifies over time. The second is mental health crisis. Many individuals in Seattle's revolving door arrest population have documented psychiatric conditions. Schizophrenia, bipolar disorder with psychotic features, severe personality disorders, and trauma-induced dissociative states are overrepresented in this group. These conditions, without consistent treatment, do not stabilize on their own. They worsen. The third, and this is the factor that investigators focus on in the interrogation room, is the absence of empathy in the moment of violence. Margaret was not a person to Fale in that moment. She could not have been. Whatever was happening in his internal world, whatever distorted reality he was navigating, whatever substance was shaping his perception, whatever psychiatric state had taken hold, it had reduced a human being who had lived 75 years of a full life to an obstacle or a target or possibly nothing at all. That is not a defense. Let me be clear about that. The absence of empathy in a moment of violence does not absolve anyone of responsibility for that violence. It does not give back Margaret's sight. It does not undo what was done. But understanding it matters. It matters because if we do not understand how a person reaches the point of carrying a board with screws through a public street and using it on a grandmother at a crosswalk, we cannot prevent the next Fale. And there will be a next one, unless something changes. In the interrogation room, detectives would have watched his effect. Did he show remorse? Did his eyes reflect the weight of what he had done? Did his body language suggest shame or calculation or dissociation? Was he present? Or was he somewhere else entirely, some internal landscape where Margaret's suffering did not register, could not register because the faculties required to register it were no longer fully operational? Whatever they saw, it informed the case. And it informed the recommendations that would follow regarding his mental health evaluation. Because a courtroom cannot sentence what it does not understand. Now we stop. We put the case file down. We set aside the charges and the sentencing ranges and the forensic documentation. And we talk about Margaret. She is 75 years old. She has been alive since 1950. She has seen things we will never fully know about. She has loved people. She has been loved. She has walked through her city for decades through the rain and the gray and the occasional Pacific Northwest sunshine, navigating intersections and bus stops and coffee shops, and all the unremarkable geography of a life lived in one place over a long time. She was not a cautionary tale. She was not a statistic. She was a person. She had routines. She had preferences. A particular coffee order, a particular route she liked to take a bench, somewhere she returned to. She had a history in Seattle that most people who talk about this story do not know and will never know because she has chosen to keep her name private. That choice deserves to be honored. She is not a prop for this documentary. She is not evidence in the argument about Seattle's public safety failures, though her suffering is absolutely central to that argument. She is not a symbol. She is a person who went out one December afternoon and came home with her face broken and the sight in her right eye gone forever. That right eye will never see again. She will navigate the rest of her life with the adjustment that permanent vision loss requires. She will relearn distances. She will compensate. She will adapt because human beings adapt, because we are built to continue even when continuing is hard. But she should not have had to. She should have been able to cross that street. That is the whole of what she deserved. Nothing complicated about it. The most basic promise that a society makes to the people who live in it: you can stand at a crosswalk. You can wait for the light. You will be safe. She was not safe. And the people who care about her, whoever they are, wherever they are, will carry December 2025 with them for the rest of their lives. So will she. This case is not unique. That is the hardest thing to say and the most important. Fale Pia's attack on Margaret is not an isolated incident of inexplicable evil. It is an event that emerged from a specific, documented, and preventable set of conditions. And those conditions have a name. They are called the revolving door. The revolving door refers to the pattern in which individuals with serious criminal histories and serious mental health or substance abuse crises cycle through the criminal justice system repeatedly without ever being held long enough or treated comprehensively enough for that cycle to break. 8 arrests in 1 year. Each of those arrests represented an encounter with law enforcement. Each encounter represented a booking, a processing, a legal proceeding of some kind. Each proceeding resulted in Fale P returning to the street. There are many reasons this happens. Bail reform policies in Washington state implemented with the genuine intention of preventing low-income individuals from being jailed simply for being unable to afford bail had the unintended consequence of making it harder to detain individuals who posed a genuine public safety risk but had not yet been convicted of a sufficiently serious crime. Overcrowded jail facilities mean that individuals arrested for lower-level offenses are frequently released quickly to manage population levels. Mental health courts and diversion programs. Theoretically, the right intervention for someone with Fale Pia's profile are chronically underfunded and oversubscribed. They cannot absorb everyone who needs them. Substance abuse treatment programs have waiting lists. Psychiatric crisis beds are scarce. And law enforcement, for all their capacity to arrest and process, cannot legally detain someone indefinitely for behavioral concerns without the specific threshold of evidence required for criminal charging. So the cycle runs, and it runs, and it runs, and it runs, until one day someone is carrying a board with screws in it, and an elderly woman is waiting at a crosswalk. The lesson of this case is not that individuals like Fale P are monsters beyond reach or understanding. The lesson is that we built the road that brought him to that crosswalk. We built it with underfunded treatment programs. We built it with bail policies that prioritize one form of justice at the expense of another. We built it with the quiet, socially acceptable decision to normalize visible crisis in our public spaces until the normalization became indistinguishable from acceptance. And Margaret paid the price. A 75-year-old woman paid the price for policy failures she had no part in creating. That is not acceptable. It should not be acceptable in Seattle. It should not be acceptable anywhere. The solution is not simple. Anyone who tells you it is simple is selling something. But complexity is not the same as impossibility. It is not impossible to fund mental health crisis services adequately. It is not impossible to create a legal framework that allows prolonged intervention for individuals with demonstrably dangerous behavioral patterns. It is not impossible to hold both values, protecting civil liberties and protecting the public at the same time. It requires will. It requires resources. It requires the political courage to say that what happened to Margaret was not an acceptable cost of doing business in a modern American city. Seattle changed after this, or at least Seattle talked about changing. Mayor, city council, police department, community organizations, advocacy groups, legal scholars, mental health professionals. Everyone had a take. Everyone had a plan. The debate was real, and some of it was productive. In the aftermath of this case, in the weeks and months that followed, there were concrete conversations about reforming the conditions that had allowed someone with Fale history to remain on the street. Whether those conversations produced lasting change is a question that only time can answer. Margaret is still alive. She has not spoken publicly about what happened to her. She does not owe anyone that. She does not owe anyone her trauma or her grief or her adaptation as a form of public education. But she is still here. And her right eye, the one that we'll never see again, is a permanent physical record of what the city of Seattle permitted to occur on one of its streets in December 2025. Fale is in the criminal justice system. Whether his sentence will be sufficient, whether he will receive the mental health and substance abuse treatment that he clearly needed years before he ever reached that crosswalk, whether he will emerge from incarceration safer than when he entered it. These are open questions. They are the questions at the heart of every case like this. Here is what I want to leave you with. When you think about this story, I want you to resist the easiest emotional response. The easiest response is rage. Rage at Fale, rage at the city, rage at the system. Rage is real and rage is valid, but rage does not build anything. It does not write a better bail policy. It does not fund a mental health crisis center. It does not prevent the next attack. What builds something is the slower, harder work of asking why. Why was he on the street? Why, after 8 encounters with the justice system, had nothing changed? What would have had to be different at what point in his history for December 2025 to have been a normal Thursday afternoon instead of the day a board with screws changed a woman's life forever? Ask that question. Keep asking it, because somewhere in the city near you, in Seattle, in Portland, in San Francisco, in Chicago, in Detroit, in every American city that is navigating this same crisis, there is someone with a record that looks a lot like Fale. And there is a woman standing at a crosswalk. And the only thing standing between them is the answer to that question. If this story affected you, please share it. Not for the views, for Margaret, for the woman who just wanted to cross the street.